years, I guess is the way to say that, while helping arts and preservation organizations navigate and recover from the devastating impact of COVID-19 pandemic. This is an opportunity to strengthen our state's leadership in the creative economy, and it's one we can't afford to miss. If you want to know more, check out yeson6-ri.com, and that link will be in the chat. Just a quick reminder before we get started, please make sure you're all on mute. Please engage with us by using the chat box to type in your questions, and we'll add them into the conversation. We will have time to take additional live questions and comments at the end of the author conversation. Use your reaction buttons to let us see your enthusiasm. If you're having any technical trouble, use the chat box to private message Tamaquag Tech for assistance. Before we begin, I would like to just take a minute to introduce myself and do a land acknowledgement in my language. You can acknowledge the land you're on. If you know the nation, put it in the chat. If not, use the tool native-land.ca, which is also in the chat. And later you can check out our guide to land acknowledgements in our belongings blog. Askawi Kwasin, Natasuis Makasini Pashao at Nahai Gansek, Natasuis Lorenz Spears at Englisha, Ni Nahai Gansek Nehantek, Kanupiam at Aki at Nahai Gansek. So hello everyone, I'm Lorenz Spears and my traditional name is Makasini Pashao. I'm the executive director here at Tamaquag Museum and I'm Narragansett Niantic. Welcome to the homelands of the Narragansett people. Now I would like to introduce you to Siobhan Senior. Siobhan is a professor of English and chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of New Hampshire. She is the editor of Dawnland Voices, an anthology of writing from Indigenous New England, and dawnlandvoices.org. Her other publications include Voices of American Indian Assimilation and Resistance, Sovereignty and Sustainability, Indigenous Literary Stewardship in New England, and essays in journals, including American Literature, American Indian Quarterly, Studies in American Indian Literatures, Malus, Disability Studies Quarterly, and Resilience. She also served as a past board member of Tamaquag Museum. So we are so happy to welcome Siobhan Senior. Please join me in clapping for her. You can use your reaction buttons and do thumbs up and hearts and all kinds of things. So you're welcome to have your screen showing. If you like to be hidden, that's fine as well. But I sure hope you'll participate in chatting away because we really want to have a conversation with Siobhan and with all of you today. And thank you to all the people putting the homelands in which they're on, everything from Narragansett to Wabanaki, Penobscot, Wampanoag, Squamish, to name just a few that I see. So today, we are so happy to have Siobhan with us, and I do miss her being on our board, and we miss seeing her on a regular. COVID-19 has made it difficult to see all our friends and relatives the way we once did. But luckily for us, we have technology because 20 years ago, this would have been difficult to do, maybe even 10 years ago. So we'll be happy for Zoom and other technologies. So I'm going to start with a question. And as we go along, if you have questions, one, we're going to be asking you questions in the chat as well that you can answer. But if you have other questions for Siobhan, please put them in there. So Siobhan, can you start with telling us a bit about your background and how you became an author?
You make it sound so exciting. Thanks for doing this, Lorraine. It's really nice to see you and to see a lot of other friends, old and current, on this Zoom chat. It's fun. So I became an author because it's my job, really. It's my job to teach and to write for other teachers, largely, and for other scholars. But when I went to grad school, I did not think I was going to write about Native American literature. I was actually going to be a Thomas Hardy scholar when I went to grad school. So if you've ever seen the movie Tess of the D'Urbervilles, where Nastasia Kinski eats the strawberry, that's the kind of stuff I wanted to study, big, juicy Victorian novels. And I just took a magic class on Native American literature when I was in graduate school and got hooked. and wound up writing my dissertation on Native American women and their responses to United States land policies in the 19th century. And then I moved to New Hampshire and New England, moved back to New England. I grew up around Boston and wound up becoming really interested in the literature of this place. So that is how I became this kind of author.
That is You know, it's funny because Siobhan, we met in a random roundabout way. You were hosting a conference on Indigenous literature and education. And Siobhan invited, unbeknownst to her, myself, my mother, my aunt Donna Jean, and there was also one other Narragansett tribal member, Misty Mars. And we were all there, and none of us talked to each other, so no one knew the other one was going. We all just kind of converged on the place, and we were like, what's happening here? Because everybody was coming at it from their own professional background in education. So we have an interesting connection. But I find that, I mean, that was actually before I was the director of Tamaquag Museum. So it just makes me realize how much we change. And so I thought maybe you could share right now what inspired you to write this current book on sovereignty and sustainability in literature. I totally butchered your title, sorry.
It's a long academic title. So this book came after a previous book that I worked with your mom on, and 10 other tribal editors, called Dawnland Voices. So it's a thick and hefty tome. So that was a collection of Native American writing that I wanted to put together because I kept trying to teach Native American writing from New England and New Hampshire, and I kept being told there isn't any. And I had a feeling that was a lie. I knew it was a lie, it had to be a lie. So I started meeting people like you and your mom and lots of other amazing writers and tribal historians all around New England. And we put together that book. It took 10 years, you may recall, to put together that book. It was a very long process because we had so many people involved and so many permissions to request and so much discussion about what should go in it. And if people could see, that book is 700 pages long. It's just massive. And I think we were all surprised by how thick it was when it came out. We all knew that there was a lot more writing than people outside your communities realized, but it was really, really big. And then when that book came out, people started teaching it in their classes in colleges and other places. And I wanted people who didn't know anything about the literature of this place to have a little more background. We have nice bibliographies, and your mom and other tribal editors and Dawnland Voices wrote really nice headnotes and introductions to the literature, but I wanted people to have a little more background about how this literature came to be, because people, even in my field, in Native American literature, the people who are professors in this field are still really surprised. They're still really surprised. If I say I teach literature from New England, Native American literature from New England, they say, oh, well, it was all oral, right? Or is any of it in English? And of course, there's a ton of it in English, and Indigenous people here started writing almost as soon as English colonists landed. I mean, they started writing really fast, and they started writing political petitions and deeds for their own lands. And then now you have people like Maddie Sayet writing plays and directing plays, and you have people writing hip hop poetry. So there's just tons and tons. And I became interested, like, why does nobody outside these communities know that there is such a robust literary history? And the thing that was chastening to me, because I was sort of trained that, you know, professors go to archives and that's where they find forgotten literature. And I remember that day, you never told me that story about you all not talking to each other before you came to UNH. I remember that day talking to you all and learning about the Narragansett Dawn, and learning that your family was writing and that you had other relatives writing. And I learned about John Christian Hopkins, and it was astonishing to me, and I'm embarrassed to say it, that all I had to do was talk to Native people, and they would say, yeah, you know, my aunt down the street wrote pageants in the 1970s and she wrote poetry for powwow flyers, and people in those communities remember that stuff. Sometimes they can even recite it. Sometimes they have copies of the Narragansett Dawn in their own houses. So Native communities were, I don't know if I feel like I've drifted off the initial question, but Native communities were way better in a way at preserving literary traditions and literary histories than the academic industrial complex was, right? Because in academia, we lose track of stuff all the time.
Well, and these are our families and our stories, so those have a lot of value to us. And I think of in the archives here, and every year we sort of recover our own knowledge in this archive because it's such an old archive, but yet not technologically advanced yet. And so we stumble on things that are these amazing booklets that we're actually talking about reestablishing a Talmaquag Press and republishing some of these booklets for people to have access to. Indian Communications by Princess Redwing. We're working on a project with Dawnland Voices to make that more easily researchable. I think I just made up that word, but making an index. We've got a volunteer who's helping us to create an index so that we can research using it. If Tarzan Brown is in volume 1 and in volume 10 and in year 2, volume 3, we could know that. Right now, everybody's got to read every volume from front to back to know where something is. We remember that it's there, but we don't know exactly where. So that's a project that we're working on to try to improve that access to these older periodicals of writing. So thinking about, you can think about it maybe in relationship to Dawnland Voices or your new book, which by the way, I left on my desk in the other room, which was not very helpful in remembering the title. I'm just wondering if you can take us through sort of how you dive into your writing project. How do you organize it? How do you, sort of establish your writing process? Because it's different when you're writing a nonfiction type of book than it is when people are writing a fictional book. So I'm curious about that process that you go through for the work that you have.
I don't know how novelists work. I'm sure they all work differently. But I have a picture in my head, of a novelist just sort of going to a writer's colony for 6 months and banging it out. And I'm sure that might happen sometimes, but it probably doesn't always happen that way. For me, I'm a pretty slow writer and I am a piecemeal writer. So this book also academic books take way too long. They take years and years and years to write, unless you're a much faster person than me. So they generally we go to academic conferences like the one I invited you and your mom and your aunt to, and we present papers. So I think probably around the time that I was putting together Dawnland Voices, I became really interested in the Narragansett Dawn in particular, and how so many people in Rhode Island, even if they didn't have copies of the magazine, knew that Princess Redwing edited it. They remembered some of the content that was in it. Like they remembered that there were articles about Tarzan Brown winning the Olympics. They remembered, which was wild to me. So I became sort of interested in how oral traditions help keep literary traditions alive. I think when I went to grad school, I was sort of trained, that oral traditions are there to preserve. They get preserved by written traditions and then they disappear. And this was almost the opposite, right? I mean, this written document, the Narragansett Dawn, I don't know if the museum now has a complete set. I remember there was a time at which you did not have a complete set.
We still do not have a complete set, but we just did an inventory so we know exactly which ones we're missing because we're on the hunt for those missing ones. But I just did get told by a family member that we have a few in a trunk, so I'm going to go find those and see what ones they are. And hopefully one of them, we have 147 of the same one in our collection. We have this huge amount of one, but we're missing, there's 2 full years, 2 volumes, we're missing 6. But all the ones we have, in most cases, we have multiple of those. So maybe we can find some people that'll swap with us.
Right. So here you are, the cultural knowledge keepers, at Narragansett, you don't have a full set, but you have a really good sense of what happened with that magazine in the 1930s and how Princess Redwing came home and started publishing it and who worked on it and why it folded. They ran out of money, and that was fascinating. So back to your question about writing process, you know, I would write a short paper like that and present it at a conference and then sort of slowly spin it up into a chapter. And then just kind of kept doing that over and over and over again until I thought, maybe this is a book.
Mm.
So.
So that's an interesting way. That sounds like you can bite into that. You didn't have to go for the whole elephant. You could do a chunk at a time. That makes sense. Um, you know, one of the questions that pops up is, how do you attack like the research piece of your, you know, your preparation? I get that you're writing, you know, one piece at a time and presenting it, but I'm talking like the background part of that.
So for this, as for Dawnland Voices, this was new for me because I was trained, again, I was trained to go to archives and look for stuff. And I was trained to use the MLA bibliography and look for other scholarly articles that were published. And there's not anybody writing about the Narragansett Dawn. There's not anybody writing about Mabel Avant in Wampanoag. So I had to go and talk to people. I had to come and talk to you and Aunt Paula and have Aunt Paula tell me, you know, what was important about the Narragansett Dawn and what happened with Princess Redwing. I had to talk to Wampanoag elders on Cape Cod who remembered, you know, so I remember one of my favorite stories about going to talk to Joan of Ant on Cape Cod was that I got all excited because I was digging through old issues of the Carlisle Indian School newspapers. So there's a lot of people on here who might not have heard of the Carlisle School, but it was an infamous boarding school in the 1880s that to which Indigenous children were taken from their families and sent, and often horribly abused. So it's a dark chapter in American history, but they published these magazines of their own. The students published magazines, and a lot of times these magazines were promotional. They were meant to show donors to the school what a good job the school was doing at assimilating these Native kids. But I was digging through them and I got very excited that I found a Wampanoag writer in the Carlisle school newspapers, Alfred DeGrasse. And I went to Joan Avant and I said, you know, this guy, Alfred DeGrasse, and she was just like, I would ask her, do you know older Native American writers? And she would say, nah. She knew about William Apess. She knew that he was there on Cape Cod. She really wanted to talk about her aunt, Mabel Avant, who did a lot of writing in the 1970s. And finally, when I brought up Alfred DeGrasse, she was like, oh yeah, him. So I was like, I realized that if I just did the digging on my own, I was going to tell the wrong story about what literature was important to the communities, right? I was going to say, here's this writer, Alfred DeGrasse, who was such a major figure in Wampanoag literary history, and he wasn't. People there don't really talk, they remember him, who he was, but they don't really talk about him. They do remember Mabel Avant. They do actually recite some of her poems at public events to this day, even though, as far as I can tell, Mabel Avant was never really published outside of some powwow flyers in the 1970s. That's amazing.
Like Ella and her poetry booklets and some of the poems that are now in Dawnland Voices, they're so beautiful and powerful, and that's what's meaningful.
Yes.
You know, there was probably the disconnect between the boarding school experience too, because that's such a taking away of culture and anglicizing it, you know, assimilating it. And so that's probably why there wasn't like as much of an embrace from the community.
Of course.
Yeah. Just an FYI, a little heads up. In the fall, keep your eyes out. We're going to be having a national exhibit coming to Rhode Island with Tamaquag Museum in partnership with the University of Rhode Island for a location because it's 22,000 square feet, but it's away from home, the boarding school experience. You know, the American Indian boarding school experience is a really powerful exhibit. So that's coming in the fall.
Oh, cool. Cool.
So I'm wondering, what was like a surprise that you found in the research? I know that you're visiting places now. Finding something in Carlisle is certainly a surprise. even though I know there were Narragansett and Wampanoag and other East Coast Indigenous people there, but I'm wondering if there were any other surprises or stories that came out of the research.
Yeah, there was a book called Life and Traditions of the Red Man that was a Penobscot book published. Margot Lukens is on here, so she might know the exact year. It's somewhere around 1890, I think. Said to be the first book published in Maine by a Penobscot man. And a professor named Annette Kolodny got kind of famous by rediscovering this book and sharing it with 1893. Thank you, Margot. 1893. And Annette Kolodny she was already famous, but she got some kudos for giving this manuscript to Duke University Press, very snobby, fancy press, and republishing it with a long introduction. And it was kind of like, here's an example of how a scholar goes through archives and rediscovers a great piece of Native American literature. But I remember being surprised when I went up to, Margot probably has saw this too. I was up in Maine, and I think I stopped at a gas station, and Penobscot people were selling Xeroxed copies of The Life and the Traditions of the Red Man for $5 in the gas station. Like, before Annette Kolodny figured out that it was there, Penobscot people knew that that book was there, right? They always remembered that book, and they were sharing that book with passersby, you know, with their own community members and with passersby. And one of the fun parts of working on Dawnland Voices was going up to Maine and talking to the Penobscot Cultural Conservation Commission, because they actually have their own IRB now, right? And they want scholars who are doing anything related to anything Penobscot to go before that board and talk with them about the ethics of publishing and what you're going to publish and what you're going to do. And I was intimidated, and it was a blast. It was a blast because I sat at that table and listened to people say things like, oh yeah, Life and Traditions of the Red Man. That book's a piece of crap. Book's a piece of crap. There was a missionary standing over his shoulder as he was writing it. If you want the real story, you need to read, you know, this book that kids published in the 1970s. And I think there's a copy down the street in the Maine University Library. So, I mean, again, these were just like all kinds of little surprises that just came by talking to people and people remembering their own literary traditions through oral history. I remember meeting Lisa Brooks for the first time years ago, and I asked her if I could buy her a beer and talk about Abenaki literature. And I said, you know, I want to learn about Abenaki literature. And she said, well, Cheryl Savageau lives right down the street. Why don't you invite her to give a talk at your university? Like, this Pulitzer-nominated poet that embarrassingly I had never heard of. And, you know, she also showed me there are old books that were published at Odanak in Quebec in the Abenaki language, and sometimes they were dictionaries and they were out of print. But she said, everyone in my family has an old copy of that we've been passing around for years. Those books aren't forgotten. That's what you all were telling me. The stuff is not forgotten. You in the academy may have forgotten about it, but we didn't forget about it.
Yes, and you know, I think when I think of Dawnland Voices, one of the things that I love so much about it is it's full of such depth. It has historical writing, it has contemporary writing, it has poetry, it has children's writing, it has recipes, it has, you know, speeches, and, you know, just so many different kinds of writing. You know, I guess my question, this is a little bit different, is how, maybe you can speak to how doing Dawnland Voices, how that influenced your current book, and, you know, how those things intersect with each other.
Thank you for asking that question, because you were saying something about, you know, writing a book piecemeal being kind of an interesting way to put it together. I never see the whole picture until I'm done with a big project. Like, I didn't know what the argument of my dissertation was until I went to the defense. That's pretty close to it. I think my dissertation director is here too, but so I didn't think about this when I was writing all those little conference papers, but when I started to see this book coming together, I did start to think about genre. So I did start to think about those literary types that sort of bubbled to the surface. And I started to wonder why, right? So with the Narragansett Dawn, I started to think, okay, an awful lot of the stuff in Dawnland Voices came out of tribal magazines or community newsletters.
Mhm.
So why is that a form that makes sense for people as opposed to a big Thomas Hardy novel, right? And they make sense, I guess, I concluded, because they're ways for the whole community to participate and contribute. So lots of different, it wasn't just Red Wing writing
Right.
the magazine, of course, right? It was people sending in news clips, and it was people sending in recipes and letters and stories and language lessons. So it was a way for the whole community to participate and actually build the community, right? I mean, the interesting thing to me about the Narragansett Dawn is that she's doing that in the 1930s when you all have been officially detribalized, right? And she's saying in that magazine, if you're Narragansett, we don't care if you're living in Wisconsin, send us your writing.
Right.
Send us your writing and we will rebuild. And it's amazing to me that a magazine and a newsletter didn't do it unilaterally, but a magazine and a newsletter can be really powerful mechanisms for people to rebuild themselves and reassert their relationships to land. By the same token, Wampanoag people just write a ton of history. Like Wampanoag people just published, they had such a long and brutal and vicious federal recognition battle, right? Where the courts kept saying, you don't exist, your history wasn't continuous. And I mean, I didn't do a count, but I don't know how many self-published or published by small presses Wampanoag history books there are with just timelines, right? That say, yes, we were.
Mhm.
Yes, we were.
Yeah, so when you talk about sovereignty and sustainability, it shows how these news periodicals, because certainly Narragansett Dawn was a pivotal piece in the documentation when, from 1880 to 1980, give or take, you're invisible, but yet you've got the Narragansett Dawn saying you're here. You've got Ellison Tarzan Brown not winning the Olympics, but winning the Boston Marathon twice. You have all these pivotal moments and all these other people writing things and documenting things that are showing that continuity, which is so critical.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm wondering if you might share a passage or two from sovereignty and sustainability. Do you have something that sticks out to you that you might like to share and tell us why it was important to you or
Sure.
um,
Sure.
impactful?
So just because Tomahawk is hosting this, I did pick a passage about the Narragansett Dawn. And I hope people haven't been on Zoom as long as I have today. This is academic writing, so I hope it's not too stultifying. But it's interesting to me. So this is, published between 1935 and 1936. The Narragansett Dawn explicitly responded to a major piece of federal Indian legislation at that time, the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. It was hailed as the Indian New Deal, and the IRA aimed to undo some of the disastrous 19th century policies designed to assimilate Indian identities and expropriate indigenous lands. Specifically, the act sought to help tribes rebuild some of their land base and restore their own governments. Its chief architect and an admitted romanticist was Indian Affairs Commissioner John Collier. And he saw indigenous nations espousing what we might now call sustainability values. For example, and he's writing in the 30s, right? So this language is, he says, man and nature are intimately cooperant and mutually dependent. And the individual and his society are wholly reciprocal, right? So some of the things you hear today in indigenous sustainability circles about reciprocity. For the purposes of this discussion, the IRA arguably opened some room for new experiments in sovereignty and sustainability, even though its legacy has proved mixed. So one person who pursued such a strategy was Ella Glasgow Peak, who lived from 1896 to 1987, also known as Princess Redwing. She left her career as an artist in New York City during this period to return home to Rhode Island, where she built a long career as a cultural ambassador. Under the name Princess Redwing, she was a vigorous performer and storyteller, a favorite interviewee for newspapers and local history writers well into her 80s. In 1958, with the anthropologist Eva Butler, she co-founded the Tamaqua Indian Memorial Museum, which has closed and reopened since its founding, and where she spent much of her remaining life curating exhibits and giving tours. She also edited and published the Narragansett Dawn. It was printed on heavy stock, 10 by 7, and each issue ran about 15 to 20 pages, and it had political editorials, traditional stories, recipes, and language lessons. It did not have many images, although its back pages ran a small handful of advertisements from local businesses. The Narragansett Dawn came out every month beginning in May 1935, and by the end of that year, the publishers were expressing their hope of reaching 1,000 subscriptions by Christmas. It cost $1 a year or 25 cents an issue. Redwing contributed quite a lot of content, as did a few regular columnists. They had one column called Listen to the Medicine Man. The title reflected the geographic and spiritual orientation of the community. It said, "We face east," but it also reflected the general optimism of the day about Indian reorganization. While it's not uncommon for periodicals to announce events and encourage people to attend, the Narragansett Dawn expresses special confidence about reconvening tribal members and reigniting old traditions. The very first issue has a plea from somebody called Eagle Eye, or the prophet, and it says, "If you are a Narragansett, send in your name and join the tribe." People did. They also sent their letters, stories, recipes, and announcements.
That's fantastic. And it's just amazing to think about how people in that generation, they didn't give up despite what the history books were saying about them, despite the land dispossession, despite the historical trauma. They still persevered, and they led the groundwork for federal recognition. They led the groundwork for us to be here today and to continue this knowledge. It's just so amazing. And I love the way that you were sort of weaving that together. Feel free, audience, to, if you have a specific question that you want to ask and you want to put it in the chat, I'm happy to weave them in as we go. But that was really amazing. And I think the idea of the reclaiming your right, even though the law was saying something different, is extraordinarily powerful. And that our children today need to remember, sometimes the laws are against us, but it's what we choose to believe and what we choose to do, which in the end will be held, it holds the power, if you will. Yeah. So that was really amazing. It's that passage even was about a bit of activism. So the next question I have for you is, given conversations around monuments, land back, protests, action at the Capitol, missing and murdered Indigenous women, how does your work speak to the pressing social issues of the day? Like, how does that, you gave us one example, but I'm wondering if you have a little more examples around how that speaks to that. Not just the one book, but your books in general.
Something that is really bothersome, especially in New England, is erasure, right? Erasure of Indigenous people in New England who are not Native. I remember your mother saying this to me when I sat next to her at lunch that first day we met. She said, "Siobhan, why are people so surprised that Native American people are still here? We have always been among you." And I think that many people who grow up in New England who are not Native and don't live near reservations or Indigenous communities, and even if they do, they're just unaware. And then it's disturbing. I can't tell if you froze up a little, Loren. Did I freeze? Did we all freeze? Peter is shaking his head. Okay. I just lost my train of thought. Oh, erasure of Indigenous people in New England is unfortunately perpetrated sometimes by people who ought to know better. So there are fights right now over people in Vermont and New Hampshire who are only state recognized on the grounds that, you know, I've heard people say it out here. It's pretty easy to get federal recognition if you're legit, and that's painful to watch. And it's when we erase Indigenous people from entire states like Vermont and New Hampshire and allow ourselves to imagine that they don't exist, we wind up running roughshod over ecologies and lands as well as cultures. Did we just lose Loren altogether?
I popped back in. I did disappear for a moment. So no, there's a question here in the chat. How has this work impacted how you look at more traditional scholarly research?
Can you say that again? Because I just got distracted by Christina's question about Red Wing.
Sure. How has this work impacted how you look at more traditional scholarly research?
Nothing against it. That's a loaded question. Who asked that?
That's why it was sent to me hidden.
Barbara.
Sorry, Siobhan.
Nothing against it. Lots of great traditional scholarly research. I just went to I was on another Zoom because we've all been on Zoom all day. I just went to a mind-blowing talk by a whole Maliseet scientist whose name I am completely blanking on. Forgive me. But this actually speaks to your question about traditional research methods, although she's talking about scientific research methods. She was interested in a botanical study that was being done up at Acadia National Park in Maine. And scientific method, Acadia National Park was concerned about sweetgrass harvesting and over-harvesting. So they wanted to study it. And they sent a botanist out whose heart may have been in the right place, but he didn't involve Indigenous communities from the start. And he did a sort of traditional set of transects and told the elders, you're going to harvest here for 2 years. And she said it was terrible. She said as a co-PI on that project, she felt awful telling her elders and her community members where to harvest and how to harvest, and that they wound up doing a parallel or shadow project that was entirely Wabanaki driven, where they told folks, you go and harvest where you need. And after 2 years, the traditional Indigenous folks study led to a massive regeneration of sweetgrass stands. And they measured the stem length, right? I mean, it came down to stem counts and stem length and all kinds of scientific things that escaped me. And the traditional botanical study actually led to a depletion of the sweetgrass stand, which is chastening because Acadia National Park was primed to tell Native people that you can't harvest here because harvesting is damaging the sweetgrass.
So is there doing it for thousands upon thousands of years?
Right. So is there a traditional literary scholarly equivalent of the botanist? Probably. Yeah, there probably is. I mean, I think I'll cop to it. I probably did it as a graduate student, right? I probably, read, not Derrida, he's a bad example, right? I probably read Homi Bhabha talking about hybridity and wrote articles about Indigenous people being hybrids or, until I talked to an actual Native person, she said, I'm not a frickin' plant. Yeah, sure. But there's plenty of traditional literary scholars. Oh, Cheryl is here. She's the one who told me I'm not a frickin' plant. Your face just popped up. I'm not a frickin' plant.
Linda asked if you could talk about intertribal publications in New England. And I'm assuming she doesn't mean your intertribal publication from New England, but like if in the archives there were intertribal publications that you stumbled on?
Yeah, there's a really interesting one that I've had digitized, and I haven't put it up on Dawnland Voices yet because I'm still working with the Boston Indian Center. The Boston Indian Center for years published a newspaper / magazine called The Circle.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been told, but I have not confirmed it, that a young Louise Erdrich was one of their first editors in the 1970s. Is there more to that question? So yes, I think they exist. There were up in Maine also before the era of federal recognition, there were quite a lot of tribal newsletters. This is sort of a sad thing. There were quite a lot of intertribal newsletters that were in the 70s that were trying to reignite people's tribal affiliations and people's tribal connections. And then after federal recognition, they all kind of went their own ways, right? So
yeah, like Sons and Daughters of the First Americans and the Indian Federation, a lot of those intertribal groups which had intertribal newsletters went more by the wayside.
Yeah.
There's probably still some floating around out there. There is a question here from Christina about whether the connection between Princess Redwing and the Ho-Chunk Princess Redwing is the same, but they're not the same. Princess Redwing here, she was Narragansett and Wampanoag.
Yep.
So,
oh, and Margot just posted the name of the Maliseet scientist who was Suzanne Greenlaw, right? She was fantastic. If you get a chance to look for Suzanne, and she's got a new book coming out. It's a children's book about sweetgrass that's coming out soon that looks wonderful. Just knocked my socks off.
Excellent. So there's a couple of other questions here. Someone's just posting. Do you have any thoughts or comments on the relationship between publishers and Indigenous writers over the years? And is your sense that Indigenous writers would rather rely on local presses or perhaps Indigenous run presses rather than major commercial presses? So go ahead and have your opinion on that.
And there are people in this Zoom who might want to speak to it. I mean, Cheryl Savageau had recent experience trying to shop a really brilliant book around to different publishers. So, you know, the big five have not always been congenial to Native American writers, and or they seem to only have room for one or two at a time, you know,
or certain regions of indigeneity,
yeah,
right? Which Northeast is not usually part of.
Yeah.
I would like to say something about that if it's okay.
Yeah.
Impossible to even find an agent. It was really disheartening. And I spent, you know this, Siobhan, I spent a couple of years really, you know, looking for agents, looking for, you know, doing research on them, you know, agents that looked like they were looking for something different or who were open to, you know, quote, multicultural, whatever. Impossible. So I ended up going with University of Nebraska Press because they had the American Indian Lives series. But that's just, it is, I think they have like room for just a few people, the large houses, and it's always people from the West.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's a standard thing. I mean, someone like John Christian Hopkins, he's a phenomenal writer, but you know, he still fights his way to get every book published. You know, he's done poetry books, he's done fiction, he's done historical, he's, you know, been a columnist for newspapers, you know, all of these things. And yet it's always a battle. So I don't think people necessarily prefer the little presses. It's just that, you know what, at some point you want to put your words out there, you want to put your perspective out there. So if that's the way that you can get it out there, that's the way that you do it. And it's difficult. And so we're hoping through sort of the work we're all doing. I know that when Siobhan was working on Dawnland Voices, one of the things why we wanted to be so part of it is that you could really get your perspective in your writing. I mean, there's not every single New England tribe is represented here, but there's 10 really great chapters. I mean, we could make a volume 2 and go from there. But it was an opportunity for people's writings to be recognized in a way that was different and more broad-based than often they could do on their own. And there, you know, for everyone that put in some writing for that, there's probably 10 others that could have, but still had fear of how people will receive what they wrote, fear, especially for those. I know a couple of poets that did not put it in because it's so raw, their personal experiences within that poetry, that it was so difficult for them to do that. And they just didn't have the confidence at that point in time. But the more we have these kinds of projects, the more Native authors that are in mainstream publications, the more it'll give a pathway for other people to take that risk.
I mean, Joe Brushak just went out and started his own press in the 1970s for this reason, right? If you're all not going to do it, I will. And Joe Brushak was the first to publish some Native writers who have since become quite esteemed and quite famous. So Margot, you have a hand? Do you have a hand up?
I do. I do.
Sure. Margot, go for it.
Well, I just I wanted to leap in on this press matter because I mean, I'm glad that there's a chapter in your book about the Brushaks and their press. And I mean, I know for a fact that there are Native people whose books either, were published by small presses and then went out of print, like Carol's first book, and now it's on demand at the Brushak's press, which seems like a really big service to writers who've started that way. The other thing is, it seems like you mentioned, I think maybe it was Lauren who mentioned the series, or no, it was Cheryl mentioned the series at Nebraska. The academic presses with specific series on Native American literatures seem to be where everything is ending up, whether it's history or oral tradition, written down, or novels or poetry from contemporary time. And that's, I hope that there's just too much, to make those series be a kind of ghetto of Native literatures. But when I first came to Maine, and Siobhan and I've talked about this a lot, looking around, almost everything was out of print. And so there's a huge opportunity, and it's a huge job to even get something back into print. So if anybody,
one of our projects is to get a book that's out of print, Strawberry Thanksgiving, written by my Aunt Paula.
Yeah,
and she had that same struggle with, that was through the Boston Children's Museum, but the publishing house, they fought her on the language that she wrote in the book, and they fought Ramona Peters on the images. One thing that sticks out in my mind is they didn't think a Native grandmother should drive. This was the 1980, maybe even 1990, somewhere around there. And she's like, I'm a grandmother, I drive. She's 81 and she still drives. So there's that battle of what the publishing house has in their own biases around what is Indigenous literature, what is Indigenous representation, what is an Indigenous story, and that's the challenge.
Mm-hmm. But it just seems like there's so many projects for people who have the energy, whether they're from Native communities or young scholars, or people who might have means and time. It would be a great service to help communities put things back into print if they want them back in print. Whether it means running interference with presses or paying subvention fees, hint hint.
Right. So
there's a question in the chat from from Derek, what lessons can academic historians learn from your work? In what ways can scholarship improve?
I don't know, I see some academic historians on here too, so making me nervous. I mean, I think a lot of historians I will say, I sort of feel like I learned how to talk to Indigenous people and communities by taking the lead of historians. I mean, Jean O'Brien is one example. I mean, there are also really great people working in museum studies like yourself. So something like, you think about how the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian was organized with tribal curators, right? The idea of sort of engaging people to speak for themselves. So I suspect there are historians who are doing this kind of work. I mean, Colin Calloway was actually always really good about consulting with Abenaki people. Margot works with Micah Pauling up at the University of Maine, who is really closely aligned with Penobscot and Passamaquoddy communities up there. I mean, everything he writes gets vetted by tribal partners. So I think there are a lot of historians doing really good work. Kudos to them.
So feel free to continue to add questions in the chat and to raise your hand. If you do raise your hand, remember to put it down after you've chatted or asked your question so we'll know.
Here's Patricia Rubitone, a real historian. She's raising her hand. She's
So I'm wondering,
Lorraine.
Siobhan, I'm wondering if you have some future goals or projects on the horizon.
I do, but since we were just talking about historians, would it be okay if we heard from Pat Rubitone?
Oh, sure. I didn't see Pat.
You may not have seen it.
Pat.
I was blanked out for part of this, but I was listening intensely. I think what's so fascinating about this is that it's in, I guess, scholarly circles, it's drummed into us that Native people's oral stories, when they're transcribed, when they're put into writing, that something is lost. And obviously that's not so. And Siobhan, could you react to that? Because I think we have to acknowledge that Native people have different modes, of expression, different ways of telling their stories, and if we, acknowledge, persistence into the 21st century and, beyond, that writing is part of it. It's part of, adapting, and it's part of these survivance stories. But I really would like to hear what you would have to say about this idea that something is lost when stories are written down.
So two things about that. I mean, one, the relays from oral to written are not one way, right? I mean, they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I remember going up to Maine, hearing Wayne Newell. Wayne Newell, who's a Passamaquoddy elder, had taken ethnographically transcribed stories from the early 1900s by Abby Alger, right? Like this old school Marm ethnographer, and he was retelling them in Passamaquoddy, right? So written texts get reused as oral texts, and oral things get written down, and sometimes oral things don't get written down. And so it's not as unidirectional as I was trained to believe by Walter Ong, for example. But the other thing about this, and it reminds me of the earlier conversation about projects. Margot said there's so many projects for us to do to get stuff. It's true. Really great Native American books go out of print in a minute and a half, right? And it would be great to, if I were a billionaire, I would set up a press and just keep everything in print. But right, it's such a good book, Stones and Switches by Lauren Simon. But the interesting thing to me about these communities that I write about in the book is that they never over invested in any one medium or any one technology, right? So it's not, and I think about this a lot because I'm in the academy where everything is always in crisis and everything is always dying, and oh my God, nobody is signing up for English classes anymore, and they're defunding our library, and literature is going to be dead. And it might not be, it's bad, don't get me wrong, it's bad, but you know, there is a question of the kinds of stories that people tell and the kinds of verbal art that they produce. They're just always going to do those things. They're always going to do these things with or without major archives, with or without the NEA. Is this being recorded? I really don't want to. Like, I'm not saying defund the NEA or right? Like, but they go on regardless, at least in communities like tribal community. I mean, Loren said earlier, it's because these are our family stories and our community stories, and they really matter. And if maybe that's what we need to build, is more communities that are truly connected to each other and connected to land bases, right? Well, there will really be a stark investment, as opposed to, I got to republish this thing for my career, or yeah. So they never overinvested in any one technology, and I think that's one thing that has enabled these literary histories and traditions to survive. I posit. I don't know if that answers your question, Pat.
No, it does, and it's an extremely important point.
Just an FYI, Pat Rubitone will be with us on May 5th at 6 o'clock for her talk on Native Providence. I just made up a whole new name for your book. So come back to us each month as we do other authors, but I'm so thrilled. We've got just a few more minutes. I just wanted to ask one last question here for you, Siobhan, like about what projects might be on the horizon for you.
This has been a weird year.
Yes, we have all been living
if you
it.
hadn't noticed, and I was all guns blazing to start working on a digital archive of tribal newsletters. And if you go to dawnlandvoices.org, a number of them are already up there. But I will confess, like COVID and some family losses have just taken a lot of steam out of me. So I'm going to say honestly, I am betwixt and between projects. I'm still really interested in tribal newsletters. I'm also working with my buddy Barbara Peterson on doing some more writing about climate activism. I kind of feel like I don't know what the future holds for us as academics. I don't know what the future holds for us as a species on this planet. And I really don't know. So if anybody wants to put me to work, feel free to put me to work. I kind of feel like I just came out of a coma of 2020, and I'm like, point me in the right direction. Somebody point me in the right direction, tell me what to do. So I know that's not really a conventional academic answer. We're always supposed to have, this great plan, this elegant plan for the next book and the next project. And I'm telling you honestly, this year has been hard.
Well, I think that gives everybody inspiration, because we often don't know what we're doing, and then all of a sudden a project unfolds. So that's a good thing. Yeah. I'm wondering, this is a fun thing, what are you reading now?
Okay, for fun? Or
I am
reading a wonderful book by Kelly Jo Ford, who's a Cherokee writer, a new Cherokee writer, who's got this book called Crooked Hallelujah, which is about 3 generations of Cherokee women and relationships between mothers and daughters and grandmothers and mothers. And it's really, really good. And I'm also reading a book semi-casually by Mark Nowak, who is not Indigenous, but he has a book called Social Poetics, and it's kind of a people's history of the poetry workshop. And and it's interesting to me because, again, Indigenous people, there's a big fancy poetry workshop for Black writers called Cave Canem. There are big poetry workshops the Landman Foundation, the Landman Foundation for Queer Writers, and there was briefly a conference called Returning the Gift that sort of tried to nurture young Native writers, and it sort of fell apart. So I'm interested in how Native writers at a really small scale, like the Wabanaki Youth Writers Project up in Maine, try to, or what you used to do at Tomaquag, right, at the school when you had when you had the Nuitwin school, how Indigenous communities sort of nurture new writers and help produce new writers. So
Right,
the Mark Nowak's book is beautiful.
Yeah, through the projects like Through Our Eyes, an Indigenous View of Mashaquag Pond, that was a collaborative with lots of Indigenous writers from, tweens all the way up to elders. So we keep doing projects like that. And our plan is to continue, especially once we get to our new facility. Yes, that's the big thing to do. I did, between myself and the Tomaquag Tech, we asked everybody else what they're reading as well. What their favorite book is or what they're reading now. I'm wondering, before we go to general Q&A, I'm wondering if you have anything else you'd like to share, Siobhan.
Cheryl Sabajo had to leave, but I want to make a plug for her wonderful book that came out in May 2020. And this book, I was so grateful that you asked me to talk about this book, because this book came out in May 2020, and who was paying attention to anything in May 2020? I know I wasn't. So it really came out with a whimper, and so did Cheryl's book. And Cheryl's book is called Out of the Crazy Woods. It's a memoir of an Abenaki woman coming to terms with a late life diagnosis of bipolar syndrome. And it's like half poetry and half prose, and it's funny and smart, and I think it's her best book. I have great respect for Cheryl as a writer. I think it's her best book yet. And
we'll have to get her on our series. We're still working our way through the summer, so we'll have to add her in as well. That would be amazing.
Really want to make a plug for that book. Really beautiful, just beautiful. That's all.
Excellent. That's great. So we did post where you can get some of Siobhan's books and things, but I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions. I know some people asked as we went along, but if you want to, raise your hand or unmute and just blurt it out, you're welcome to ask a question now and continue our conversation. Even those people that are hidden and don't have their screen showing, if you want to pop on and ask a question, because I see lots of people that have been listening in but have not necessarily been visible. They're welcome to pop on and ask a question, or just unmute and ask a question. Or put it in the chat.
I'm reading back over the chat now.
I like this. Barbara was saying, I think Siobhan's work shows how research and academics can be effective activism. And I think that's true. That's one of the things about bringing voice to often unheard people or less heard people. So that's wonderful. Mm-hmm. There was
Margot,
go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to recur to what Siobhan was saying in response to your question about what's your next project. I had a conversation the other day with the guy at UMaine who directs our Mitchell Center for Sustainability Studies. And we were talking about research and sustainability. And we were talking about a publishing project that I'm doing with Penobscot Nation. And I said to him, the way it started was I had been working with Carol Dana and some other people from Penobscot on a theater version of some of the Transformer tales that Frank Speck had collected and published in 1918. And as soon as we got done with the play, the shows had all happened, we were at a radio station being interviewed by Donna Loring, all about the play and the events there. And we got out in the parking lot after the interview, and Carol turned to me and she said, Margot, we need to republish those stories. And that was the fall of, or like late summer of 2016. And I was just about to start a whole year sabbatical. I had all these projects, I'd said to my department I was going to republish, I was going to polish these papers and make them, into journal articles and blah, blah, blah. But right there, I said, Carol, that's exactly what I want to do on my sabbatical. And as an academic, it was a completely irresponsible moment. I just chucked the plans that I had told my department and took on this other project of republishing, because that was what Carol had begun thinking about as being the important thing. And I said, it was totally irresponsible, but it was responsive. And I think, there's a way that scholars have to be able to let that happen.
Yeah.
And we live in a kind of a rigid environment, or we let ourselves become ruled by that environment. But I think our responsibility now really is to turn more responsive than responsible.
Amen to that.
There's a couple questions in the chat. One question is, what are the oldest writings in New England indigenous peoples that you came across, I imagine is what they mean?
Well, it depends on how you define writing, right? So there are definitely things like birch bark maps that predate writings in English, but some of the earliest writings in English that wind up in the Dawnland Voices book are writings that were done in the Wampanoag language. I mean, as early as the 1650s, 1660s, because missionaries came to Wampanoag communities and tried to Christianize them and teach them English. And then they quickly started writing in English to say, get off my land, basically. So those are some of the oldest, but there are other ways of thinking about writing, even to consider a basket, a piece of writing, or a map, a piece of writing, or, but if you just want to say straight up, the oldest, I think maybe the oldest piece of writing in Dawnland is a note that was allegedly tacked to a tree during King Philip's War, possibly written by James the Printer. Pretty old, but so early to mid, well, King Philip's War is later, 1670. So yeah, probably the earliest stuff were those Wampanoag language writings that have been translated.
So there's another question here. How did you go about recording or writing oral history?
I did not. If I'm understanding the question correctly, I have not recorded any oral histories. I have not written any oral histories down. Everything that I talk about in sovereignty and sustainability and that is in Dawnland Voices is stuff written by Indigenous people in English. Sometimes they are recording oral histories.
Yes, there's a lot of that in Dawnland Voices where people are writing down oral histories, even back to the Revolutionary War. And so there's another question from Connor. When you were assembling Dawnland Voices, was your juxtaposition of documents from the state legislation or other preserved documents and more folklore-based selections intentional? I found the intersection very interesting.
Oh, that's a really great question. And in fact, one of the things I really appreciated about the way Dawnland Voices unfolded is that it was up to the tribal editors. So each tribal nation was edited by a tribal historian, and it was the tribal historians who decided, and it was ridiculous, right? Because each tribal nation only had 50 pages. I mean, the book is still massive, but it was like, you got to cap it at 50 pages. And so it is pretty interesting. For example, the Micmac section is quite legalistic because Jaime Batiste, who was the tribal editor for that section, is an Indigenous attorney, and he is very interested in Mi'kmaq legal history. And then Donald Soktoma is an historian, a tribal historian, and he was quite interested in, he has lots and lots of older tribal documents. And then he's also a poet. So he happened to choose a lot of poetry from Passamaquoddy. Yeah, so that wasn't my intention, but there were sort of more localized intentions on the parts of the tribal editors, and it's cool. The Narragansett section I thought was quite focused on, or quite emergent from the Tamaquag Museum and the family, right? I mean, Loren's family has been real movers and shakers cultural knowledge keepers in that community for a long time. So a lot of those pieces came from that. Yeah, it's really
and that section had a lot on education, and the editor, who was my mother, is a retired teacher. I'm a teacher. My sister who's in it is a teacher. My brother-in-law who's in it is a teacher. So there was, and not that there weren't other people, because John Christian Hopkins is there, Ella Sikatow is there, writings from Dawnland Voices are there, and the letter, I think is really cool, the letter from Eliza Wheelock School, the Eliza Wheelock letter. Yeah. So there's those really unique kinds of old historical documents that tell a point in history that are really powerful. That was from Dawnland Voices. So that was really great. Oh, I am looking at the time and I am not doing my job efficiently. So I'm going to do our last couple of things, because I'm going to first thank Siobhan for sharing with us. It was so riveting. We're even going over time, and that is great. But I want to just thank you so much, and the audience can thank you in the chat and put up the emojis to thank you. It was so interesting and fascinating, and I hope people will buy your book and read that, as well as Dawnland Voices. I want you to know our next session of Literature and Culture Author Conversations is Wednesday, March 24th, and we have Amy Denoden, who's going to be sharing her, having the conversation about literature, but with a focus on her book, Beyond Conquest. So we hope you'll return for that free program, and you can register on our events page just like you did this evening. If you're not part of our Indigenous Author Book Club held on Tuesday evenings, that's a much more casual conversation for the group, all reading the same book. The next book is Son of a Trickster by Eden Robinson, so you can join that. And if you're really into a fun afternoon, this Saturday, in partnership with We Are the Seeds, from 3 to 5, we're doing our second of our collaborative Native Artists workshop series, and we have Brenda Hill, who's going to be teaching us pottery, and you can be really fancy and have actual clay, or you can use Play-Doh or modeling clay, or make your own clay out of flour and water and make a whole mess, which is probably what I'll do with my grandson, who's 2.5. So, but it will be fun. It'll be meditative. We'll learn some things, and that's this Saturday, also free. And just thank you again to our sponsors, Rhode Island Council on the Arts, Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, USDA Rural Development, and the New England Foundation for the Arts, and generous donors that help us do all the work that we do here at Tamaquag Museum with their tax-deductible donations. We continue to book virtual museum education programs for groups and schools and organizations. You can visit our website, tamaquagmuseum.org, to learn more about scheduling a visit, or give us a call and schedule one. You can also support Tamaquag Museum and lots of local Indigenous artists by visiting our online store. Every week, some new things go up. One of our volunteers was taking pictures today of some of our new products from local Native artists. And so that is great. And you can even buy Dawnland Voices from us. And as soon as we get it up, we have her newest books, Sovereignty and Sustainability. We've taken the picture. Now we just need to get it online. So hopefully by next week, when our intern is in on Monday. Thank you to our Tamaquag Tech, which happens to be our Wampanoag college student, Haley, who is been doing a great job as our tech tonight. So thank you again, everyone. Wuni Nukan, have a good night, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, Siobhan.
Thank you, everybody. So nice to see everybody. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming on so everyone can see you, Haley.
You did great, Haley. You were awesome.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you soon, Pat.
Is your mother?
This was wonderful. I really enjoyed this evening.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. It was so great.
Looking forward to your talk too. Great.
Yeah.
Bye.
Margot, thanks. You're a pal. Amy, nice to see you.
And I think you had sent me Cheryl Savageau's info, didn't you?
I can send it again if you need me to.
Yeah, if you can. So it'll be at the top because I will call her because I haven't finished my all the way around the world into the fall, which I was trying to do. So that will be great. It would be wonderful.
Is your mom here? Is Dawn?
She may have been. I don't know if she was on the thing. There were so many people I couldn't look quick. Oh, I see Dawn Dove.
Yeah.
She's probably laying down listening.
That's fine.
Can you hear me, Mom? There's only 7 people left, so I figured I'd be fresh. You can stop recording, Haley, too. We don't have to record the banter at the end.
That's the best part.